But you do need to be really close to it for it to work.
All right. And I really need it. I'm very soft-spoken.
Are you?
Yes.
I'm an organizer, so I'm really pretty loud, but it's for the recording also.
I was sent to speech therapy when I was in second class because my teachers wouldn't hear me.
Sweet. I'm also a fifth child, so I think as the youngest child, you learn to speak loudly because otherwise nobody will ever hear you or do anything you're asking them to do. I think we should start.
We are going to get started. I know there are still, this feels very loud. Do I need? Okay.
No, you're good.
Okay. Michael says good. Okay. And I know we'll have some people joining us, but I just want to frame this conversation a little bit that's going to happen today. And just say that in this week's Parsha, actually, that Hazel just read this morning, is one of the times where we are told, when you reap your harvest and overlook part of the field, you have to leave it. You can't go back to it because that is supposed to be left for the stranger and for other people who are in a similar situation. And we're reminded so often of our obligation to protect the stranger, to care for the stranger, to embrace the stranger, mostly because we know what it's like to be the stranger. And for over 100 years, HIAS has been the Jewish answer to the question of how do we live out those values. And for over 100 years, HIAS has helped to resettle refugees around the world and really honor our commitment to love the stranger. And so we're really excited today to have a chance to have kind of a difficult conversation, but a really important one about the state of refugees around the world. So I will hand it off to Brooke.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Jensen. I'm going to take a minute first to introduce Rafael a little bit, our guest, just to give you a little bit of a sense of his biography. And then we'll just launch into a conversation. And really grateful to all of you for being here to participate in this, and grateful, of course, to Rafael Marcus from HIAS for joining us today. So Rafael Marcus joined HIAS in 2018 as the Senior Vice President of its Programs Division. He's in charge of international programs, U.S. programs, emergency response, and humanitarian partnership policy and practice. Before he was at HIAS, Rafael served as the Director of International Operations and Chief Security Officer and Desk Officer for East Africa at Humedica International, which is a German-based humanitarian organization. He has served in refugee response in many places around the world, in the Philippines and in Nepal, and in Liberia, in Haiti. Rafael has had really a remarkable career in doing this work, taking care of people in the face of tremendous hardship and disaster, and working with HIAS now for these many years, helping to help this Jewish agency to welcome refugees and to resettle people who are experiencing the trauma of being uprooted from their homes around the world. So we're grateful to Rafael for joining us today and excited to jump into this conversation with him about the work that HIAS is doing and what we can do to be a part of that work. I want to just also call out Joe Goldman, who's here. Joe Goldman is our regional HIAS person who's, I'm terrible at titles. Joe, help me. Community Engagement Director here at HIAS in Los Angeles, a partner whom we have had the pleasure to work with closely over many years. We are always grateful to have Joe with us here. And also Nikki Saltzman is also here from HIAS today. So thank you, Nikki, for joining us as well. All right. So Rafael, I want to just give you a second to introduce yourself and say hello, and then we'll jump into our questions.
Sure. No, thank you, everyone, for having me. I feel I have big shoes to step in because Hazel's speech was just amazing, as well as her Torah reading. But I'm really happy to be here. I must say I'm slightly pumped up because the energy in this community here is just really amazing. But yeah, so as said, Rafael Marcus, Chief Programs Officer at HIAS. I live in Silver Spring with my wife and my beautiful daughter. I have a second daughter coming in 2 months. Thank you. So, yeah, I've had a very intensive week, I can say. It started off in Germany, actually, in Berlin, where I had meetings with the German Foreign Ministry about issues regarding refugees in the Mediterranean. We continued to LA. We spent some time in San Diego and Tijuana over the last 2 days, and we're here. But very glad to be here and really appreciative of having the chance to speak to all of you.
Thank you. So, Rafael, we understand that there are 4 existential threats that we see converging in our refugee and asylum crisis. And I want to ask you about how you as an individual and HIAS as an organization see those threats and how they're shaping the work that you do. So we see those threats as climate devastation, the rise in authoritarianism, the global rise in poverty and inequality, and war, both civil war and between nation states around the world, and how it's affecting refugees. But we also know that the system that we have for refugee resettlement and asylum are really not built around climate change and economic deprivation. They're rooted in the idea that people deserve refugee status only when they are being persecuted for who they are, for what they believe, or because they have been displaced by war. So we're curious, how are people in the refugee resettlement space, in the work that you do in Washington, the people that you talk to at UN agencies or the EU, how are they thinking about and talking about climate and economic refugees, and how the growth in those categories of people is changing our response?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Because I think if you look at the 4 categories, the one that stands out for me is climate change, because climate change does have an effect on all the 3 other categories. We see more wars fueled by climate change. We see poverty fueled by climate change. And so climate change has a very central role in displacement right now. That said, climate change is not part of the language in the 1951 Refugee Convention, which is the basis for eventually receiving refugee status. We are not really looking at changing the 1951 Convention language because we are afraid that in the current state, we would not want to open it up again because we might end up with something worse. So our work right now, and with us, I mean HIAS, but also the humanitarian community at large, is really trying to make sure that we just can include climate movements into our work, eventually also making sure that it is not necessarily about why you had to flee, but why you can't go back. And that has been kind of the best, I would say, legal loophole to make sure that we can also take climate refugees into account. But I think the really more important work is to really make sure that we understand that those things cannot be parceled out, because again, one has an effect on the other. And in fact, we see many people in places like in Honduras or Guatemala being displaced by climate change. They are then internally displaced, but then again displaced because of violence, because of poverty. And so there is usually not one real cause for somebody to decide and move out of a country. It is often really a secondary displacement. So people really, most of the time, are first displaced within their own country. And those reasons then add up. And so we are trying not to kind of try to figure out what is this single reason why somebody left, but really trying for people to understand that it is really the combination of many things that cause people to flee. But what's important, I think, is to understand also that as a humanitarian organization, we are not necessarily the right organization to solve the problem. I always say there are no humanitarian solutions for humanitarian problems. The solutions need to come from politicians. The solutions need to come from countries. We are here to fill the gap, and the gap is pretty wide because governments don't take the responsibility really. But we cannot really solve the problem, but we can help to alleviate the problem, and we can help to make sure that people who do need to flee can find a new home. So that's how we see it, but we are continuously engaged in conversation. I think one problem with climate change is that the climate action or the climate activism and the humanitarian community have not yet really converged. And I would actually love for the humanitarian community to to reestablish this this energy that currently is behind the climate activism. I think the humanitarian community, because it has been going on for a long time, I think one of the big starts was really in the 1980s during the big famine in Ethiopia. But I think we lost some energy, and I think if the humanitarian community and the climate community would come together more and really speak a bit more about the interface, it would really benefit everyone.
Thank you. I'm curious about what you just said. Like, why is that? Why do you think the humanitarian community has lost energy? I mean, the crisis has gotten only worse and worse and worse.
I think that's part of the problem. I think we are seeing more and more conflict, and we are seeing conflict becoming longer and longer. So we are seeing more and more protracted crises. I don't know how many people still think about what's going on in Syria. It kind of, so many things happened in the meantime, right? We had Ukraine, now there's Sudan. We are very much carefully looking what's happening in Niger right now, where there was a coup. There's the Rohingya in Bangladesh. These are all things that happened after what happened in Syria already over a decade ago. And so that the fact that we are seeing longer and more protracted crises is also causing something which is called donor fatigue. Quite honestly, we are overburdened. The humanitarian community has to take on too much. We are not enough people. Our pledges for funding are never really covered. The Ukraine crisis was an outlier. I think that's really important for us to understand. I think everyone has been engaged in Ukraine. Everyone has worried about Ukraine, and we're very much looking at how things are developing there. But this sort of attention, this sort of engagement is an exception.
All right, well, we'll get back to Ukraine in a minute, but I actually wanted to start closer to home now. You mentioned that you just came back from Tijuana, and I would like to ask you about that. So obviously for us, that is the refugee crisis that is closest to our homes, is the southern border of the United States and the people who are fleeing from, not just from Mexico, but from points much further away and coming across the southern border of the United States. So would just love for you to share a little bit about what you just saw with your colleagues from HIAS Mexico and Tijuana, and tell us more about what HIAS is doing there and how we can get involved in that work too.
Sure, no, gladly. It was complicated for me to be in Tijuana and San Diego, I think, because it is, because I hold a global portfolio and I see, not only the work that we're doing in countries such as in the US where people eventually arrive, or even not only in countries of transit like in Mexico, but in countries of origin, like Venezuela, like Ukraine. It is complicated because eventually what we are seeing here, and you're very much right to say this is our crisis, this is the crisis which is closest to our heart. But what we're seeing here is like if you would take a big funnel and you really only see what's dripping down is kind of those people who actually made it here. 80% of refugees are in low or middle income countries. Most of them are actually in countries neighboring the country that they fled. And so these are countries very far away from here. Although more and more we also see people really fleeing from Latin American countries. But you're right, the people we saw, they came from places such as Haiti, from Angola. We were in a shelter in San Diego where they had the flags hanged up from people, from where the people came from. First of all, there must have been at least 40 or 50 different flags. And they were from everywhere. That was Asia, there were Far East Asia, mainly Africa, and then also Latin America. So it's really a problem that, it's a global problem. It's a problem where the less resourced countries are really having the biggest responsibility to take on. And so our part here in the US is really important, but it is really the tip of the iceberg. It is also because not everyone, and I think that's really important as a narrative here in the US to establish more and more, not everybody is trying to get to the US. Mexico, for example, has the third largest amount of asylum claims in the world. So many people are actually trying to integrate in Mexico, and we see that along the route in Latin America. You asked about what HIAS is doing. So one thing, HIAS has country offices in 23 countries. We have almost 2,000 staff working in more than 70 field offices around the world. And a lot of those offices are in Latin America, where we have staff in Venezuela, and along the route, besides El Salvador and Nicaragua, we are present in every country which is on the route. And so we provide services for people, those who want to move, but also those who want to stay. And we see a lot of people staying in countries where we work. And our work is not primarily resettlement, actually, because resettlement numbers are not enough. We see 200,000 people at best maybe resettled over a year in the world. Given that we are seeing 110 million refugees, this is a solution for a very small part of refugees. And so most of our services are actually not resettlement. We provide legal protection services, economic inclusion services, mental health and psychosocial support, and prevention and response to gender-based violence. And we provide those services in each country, and that is also because in each country we have a large amount of refugees who are trying actually to become self-sustainable and to integrate. So that just to say that it is not that everybody is trying to come to the US and to build a home in the US. It is eventually what happens if they cannot manage to do so along the route, and we are helping along the route. We do integrate quite a lot of people in countries such as in Ecuador, in Costa Rica, which has a huge refugee community, and also in Mexico. But given the large numbers of refugees that are there, we do see also still quite a substantial amount coming up to the US and to the border, and we saw that in San Diego with really buses arriving to a shelter where they are then oriented, where they're given new clothes. They can stay there for 1-2 days before they then move on to their families or to their friends. And I will just end with one last thing about that, because I think one of the really nice things that we saw in that shelter was a wall with notes of gratitude that people had written. And again, those notes of gratitude were in Portuguese, they were in Spanish, they were in Creole, they were in Hindi, they were in Farsi, they were in all the languages, because people are coming from all around the world to find safety. But this wall was really important because it really showed us why we do that work, why we are encouraging you to do that work. And I know that the congregation here also had a welcome circle to welcome Afghans, but it was really kind of my wailing wall for this week, and kind of really seeing why we are doing what we're doing.
Thank you. Yeah, and I want to say that several of the people in this room were part of our Afghan welcome circle, and that experience, I think, was for many people deeply affecting in terms of how it helped us understand what the refugee crisis is, and what the human work is that is required for people to really become integrated into a new home. I was delighted to hear from Joe not long ago now that HIAS is partnering with JFS Long Beach to become a resettlement agency. And I just want to give you an opportunity to share a little bit about what that means for resettlement that HIAS will be doing in the Los Angeles area.
Well, first of all, it means that HIAS is back in LA resettling refugees, which is wonderful. And it really means that we have the ability to have a more continuous, a more engaged relationship between ourselves and the communities. Resettlement is something which is, it is really the best solution. It is the solution for the smallest amount of refugees, but those that eventually are resettled, it is the best solution. because it comes with the benefits that they need in order to really build up a new life. It is done in a way that really is community-based. Right, we work with JFS who have already the contact to community, because in order to integrate, you need community. There's no other way. You need community. You cannot have somebody integrated simply by an organization. You need a community. You need people who stand behind that organization and take those people into their houses and help them. And that's also why volunteerism is important, because volunteerism is not only about filling a gap. It is also about not necessarily only having this professional approach, but really having this more human-to-human approach. And I think resettlement provides that opportunity, because it is a pipeline. It is something which can be planned a bit more in advance, and it is a sign of strength. I think it is a sign of strength for us here in the US, especially. We went through quite some difficult years where the resettlement structure, or I don't know how the whole system of resettlement in the US was really kind of decapitated, and so I think it is a sign of us building up. It is we started the Trump administration with 13 affiliates around the nation. We are going to start the next fiscal year with 24 affiliates across the nation. So I think we are really building up something again, which is visible, which is more sustainable, and which really engages the community in a more thoughtful way. And I think that's really important, especially also here. That said, it's not easy. You mentioned already, and the rabbi also mentioned in his sermon, that the housing prices, it is a tough cookie. But given that there are so many communities already here, and we also really want to make sure that people are resettled to places where they already have a community or friends or family, I think it's really, really important that we took that step and are able to resettle refugees again in LA.
Yeah, absolutely. So how has the Biden administration changed its policies for people seeking asylum from what the Trump administration had put into place? You described the decapitation of the system and that there's been some rebuilding, but I also know that it's not everything that we would want it to be. What has not changed since Biden took office, and what are the limitations of their approach for people seeking safety in the United States?
What has not changed is that there's still a completely dysfunctional asylum system in the US. And what has also not changed is that refugees and asylum issues are still politicized. They're used as a tool. It is still a political issue, and that's really what we would love to see going away. We would love to see it become I even don't like to call it a bipartisan issue, because then I still call it a political issue. Yeah. But just an issue which is, normal for everyone to understand as something which relates to human rights and to refugee rights. I think what the Biden administration has done on the positive side is really the rebuilding of the resettlement structure, increasing the numbers of people that can be resettled, and really providing the resources also for resettlement agencies to really build up and regain the strength that we had a few years ago. But on the downside, when it comes to non-resettlement related issues, and that is really about people being able to cross the border and seek asylum, the Biden administration has done, I won't be able to tell you what it has done in a few minutes, because it has done many, many different things, and it has basically caused a lot of confusion. A lot of policies being introduced time after time, changing things. I mean, our lawyers that we have in various places, they really have to pivot every now and then, every few months, because the regulations change. And the regulations are also not really encouraging, it's more about managing migration before people come to the US, instead of managing the asylum system once people cross into the US. And by management, I mean finding policies that eventually lead to less people being able to move where they want to move to. So the Biden administration has done a bit of, well, we will do this in order to keep refugee-friendly voters okay on our side, but at the same time we will change some policies here. And so there are, there's a new policy, for example, where certain nationalities, if they move after a certain date, if they cross the border after a certain date, they're not allowed to get into the US anymore, because they should try to either integrate in wherever they are right now, or there is now a new system of trying to find either a private sponsor or getting refugee status in that country where they are and then flying into the US. Now, it is always giving something and taking something away. The problem with these policies really is that it also confuses very much the migrants themselves. They also by now just don't know what to do, and that is a big part of our job, is just informing them about the status quo. But it also makes it also makes it less and less vulnerability based, meaning it is less about the vulnerability of a person to be able to access asylum. It is much more about those that actually have a passport, which is now a requirement to be able to fly into the US and seek asylum. So you have to have a passport to begin with. You have to have someone in the US who will file a sponsorship for you. So you need to have those ties already. And if you look at the people, the most vulnerable will be those that do not have any ties to the US, that do not have any passport because they just got up and they left. So a lot of changes. Some of them good, some of them bad, but the bottom line is our asylum system is still a mess. And we are really at a place where we should put much more effort into not managing asylum overseas, but or managing movement of people overseas, but managing what happens once people cross into the US.
What do you think it would take to change the political will in this country to create an actually effective system? And I know that this is not really what you do, that you're more of a resettlement agency, so I appreciate I'm asking you something that's maybe a little outside your wheelhouse, but...
I don't know if it's outside my wheelhouse. It's also something maybe I'm too humble, but I feel like after 4 years, I still don't understand the U.S. society enough. I think one thing the U.S. should do, and I'm not saying that they should do that because it would change what U.S. Citizens might think, but for another reason, but that could be a side effect, is we also need other countries to step up. I mean, to be completely honest, the resettlement numbers that we're seeing in Canada, that we're seeing in Australia, UK, and countries that currently do not have any resettlement numbers at all, many of them in Europe, we also have to put pressure on other countries to step up their game. The US has been a very large resettlement, or their largest resettlement country for many years, besides during the Trump administration. And I think it is important for people to understand that this is a global effort and not necessarily only a US effort. But then there are other things, and I think it goes back again to community engagement. And I don't know, maybe Joe, you wanna speak to that?
Advocacy is just super, super, super duper important. Add a few extra supers in there. And actually, Rafael can talk even more about this with the difference of what you see in California versus like Texas, how asylum seekers are treated. But it's also an opportunity. I will pass these on, like literally how you get involved, because we need you to be working with us on the advocacy front, which I mean, IKAR, you're a very sophisticated community. You know that doesn't mean it's partisan, but politicians have to hear that this matters to you, because they're not hearing that. They're only hearing from people who are awful bigots and hate people think for their wrongs. So they need to hear from us, and I will help you make sure that they hear from you.
So I'm just going to repeat into the microphone for the benefit of our recording that what Joe is telling us is the importance of the advocacy work that we need to do in partnership with HIAS. We're going to be sharing some information from Joe about ways we can help with advocacy after today's conversation, and really hope you all will join with us in doing that work and lifting our voices, because our elected officials need to hear from us that this is an issue that we're paying attention to and that we have expectations about what they're going to do to help follow through on our values. So I want to kind of hop to because HIAS is working in so many countries, and I want to ask for your expertise on a number of them. So we know that in Ukraine, HIAS is supporting work to care for refugees, and also the risks that the humanitarian workers face when they're on the job on the front lines. I heard that just last week a HIAS partner worker, in fact, was killed in Kharkiv. So can you talk to us about how HIAS thinks about those risks to your own workers who are supporting people living in active conflict zones?
Yeah, no, thank you for mentioning that, and our hearts really go out to the family of that member of Right to Protection, which is a partner organization that HIAS actually founded in 2013 when HIAS left Ukraine, not thinking that we would have to go back again. There are several ways of us dealing with that complex situation. One thing is, quite honestly, there is a certain risk appetite that humanitarian agencies need to have, and HIAS has that risk appetite. That does not mean that we just simply have a risk appetite. It means that we build up a very solid safety and security system to keep our staff safe, which I have witnessed 3 times over the last year and a half when I have visited Ukraine. What that means is much higher costs for our operations. Donors do not necessarily cover costs such as armed vehicles, bulletproof vests, helmets. We even have stored iodine medicine in case the nuclear facilities blow up. I mean, we really are thinking very far in terms of the scenario planning, because we have over 80 staff there. So we have, I think about 85 staff across Ukraine. Another way of dealing with it, and that's the more important way, I would say, is how can we make sure that to begin with, we are not a target? And that is really by making sure that we are not seen as a political entity. We are a humanitarian organization. We are neutral. We are impartial. We help based on needs alone. That's what's driving our aid. And we're independent. We work according to our strategy, and so making sure that all parts of that war understand what HIAS is eventually what gives us access to people and guarantees us security. That is not always enough. We've seen over the last 10 years more and more humanitarian workers being targeted by warring factions. It came to a very serious height actually during the Syria crisis, but it continues really in other places. In Sudan right now, humanitarian agencies, all their headquarters are looted by warring factions, and Ukraine is not an outlier. So, but it is those two things really, making sure that we have the right safety and security procedures in place, the right equipment, and really invest into making sure that our duty of care goes that extra mile. But on the other hand, really making sure that people perceive us as what we are, which is a neutral humanitarian agency that is simply there to help the people. We are not part of the war. And we do very much hope that eventually we will also be able to cross front lines and be able to provide services to people who are occupied by Russian forces. And that is one big reason why we are there as an international organization, because that's something that Ukrainian organizations might not be able to do.
Are you seeing an increasing demand for resettlement support from Jews from Russia and Ukraine as a result of the war? And where are you helping those people resettle now?
Yes, I mean, we, since a lot of the, a lot of refugees came out of Ukraine. Before the war escalated, there were about 250,000 Jews in Ukraine, and therefore a lot of the refugees also are Jewish. The same amounts for Jewish people out of Russia. And actually, a lot of our work happens in Israel. And Israel actually received much more Russians than Ukrainians over the last year and a half. And so that is one part. We help the Jews that have, and also the non-Jewish population of Russians and Ukrainians that made it to Israel through our office in Israel, which we have an office there that works now with Russians and Ukrainians, but before that worked really with the asylum seeker population from Eritrea and Sudan. At the same time, we are also working with Jewish communities in Moldova, in Romania, in Poland, and elsewhere, in order to make sure that, first of all, that they have the resources to do their response. They have their own response, and they were actually the first recipient of our aid just in the first 2 weeks after the escalation. But also helping in making sure that we can have Jewish people resettled, or I wouldn't call it resettled because it's not through a government resettlement program, but relocated to Jewish communities across Europe and also in the US. And so the way we had a welcome circle here for Afghans, for example, we have welcome circles right now for Ukrainians in Dublin, in Barcelona, in Berlin, in Budapest, in Prague. So many places where we're really working with Jewish communities in order for them to be able to receive Ukrainian Jews. We have a very innovative software, actually, where we can put in the most important attributes of a refugee, like, for example, kosher, yes, no, what kind of kosher, what kind of community they're looking for, and then it correlates it with the communities that we know that are ready to accept, and so that's how we create the best match for them.
With the work that you're doing in Israel, what can you share about the changes in the Israeli government that are going on right now and how that affects your work and may continue to affect your work as Israel is experiencing its own crisis of democracy and of reaction? I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Yeah. I think a lot about that. I am Israeli, and so this is definitely a topic which is very close to my heart. And Israel had a democratic crisis for quite some years. There was a joke that I heard last year which said there are 3 seasons in Israel. It's either summer, it's either elections, or it's an intifada. And at every stage of the year, we are wondering what season is next. And so, we went through so many elections over the last couple of years, but we are now really at the point where we kind of got the worst outcome that we can hope for, and that is really the Netanyahu government trying to push for a reform which would basically take away our last tool that we have to ensure that refugee rights are accepted in Israel. Israel has had a very complicated relationship with asylum seekers and the asylum system, or basically it doesn't have a real good asylum system. This is unfortunate because we actually were 10 years ago, HIAS and the Israel government worked really very well hand in hand in order to establish the asylum system, but then eventually Benjamin Netanyahu kind of disengaged and kind of abandoned building up an asylum system. And so the only tool that we often have is really legal protection and legal litigation. We can provide them. We can provide them with work. We can make them help finding work, but most of them really don't have work permits. It is very hard to receive work permit as an asylum seeker. We gave out a report 2 years ago which shows that refugee status requests, the approval rate in Israel stands at 0.86%.
How does that compare to the United States?
I don't know. I know that in terms of OECD countries, it is more than 60% for sure. I won't say any number about the US because I would be lying, I don't know. But 0.86%, especially thinking where those people come from. I mean, we are talking about more or less 30,000 asylum seekers in Israel coming from places like Eritrea and South Sudan. Most of them actually from Eritrea or South Sudan. So an approval rate of 0.86% just does not make sense. Eritrea is a completely totalitarian dictatorship. South Sudan is a country which is in civil war for since it gained independence, actually. So this approval rate does not make sense. And so the reform would eventually take away this, the clause of reasonableness, which was really a clause that the High Court could use whenever the government came down with policies that didn't make sense. For example, during COVID, asylum seekers had to put 20% of their salary into a different account as a deposit. We managed to change that back again, but that we only managed through the court. And if this reform would go forward, then it's really the last line of defense that we would lose. So we're trying not to make it about refugees, because it's not. It is really about something much bigger, but we're trying to make sure that people understand that it is about refugees, because they would suffer. And like, like in every democracy that is slowly being dismantled, the ones who will be suffering are the minorities and the most vulnerable, and these are the asylum seekers together with all the other minorities in Israel.
Yeah. So there are so many conflicts around the world, but we know that our press and, frankly, the U.S. public pays a lot more attention to those that are happening in Europe than we have to those unfolding in Africa. But HIAS, in fact, continues to work in Africa. And I want to ask you to help us understand better, in particular, what's happening right now in Sudan and Chad, and tell us what HIAS is doing to support the people there. Let me just start with that.
Yeah. No, thank you for asking that, because it's important for us to realize that Africa is still the continent that houses the biggest share of displaced people in the world. And as I often say, that's where the crisis is. We are dealing with a crisis here. It is a crisis, but the real big crisis is in Africa, or in many countries of Africa is huge. What's happening in Sudan is a disaster, especially because there were very high hopes in actually Sudan being able to transition to democracy over the last 3 years. It all really blew up in our face. I will be completely honest, the humanitarian community was absolutely not prepared for that. We had not really imagined that this would happen, but it happened at a pace which, made it very hard to respond. It is still very hard to respond in Sudan. What's happening in Sudan is basically a civil war between two fractions that were still forming some sort of temporary government together. One is the Rapid Response Forces, led by Hamdati, and the other one are what is kind of seen as the Sudanese government forces. It is still very hard to be able to respond in Sudan. It is almost impossible to respond in Sudan right now. 80% of hospitals in Sudan are not functional. There is no way of receiving visas to go into Sudan, so international humanitarian workers cannot really join. And there's displacement all over Sudan. But then there's also displacement into Chad. And the reason for that is that Chad and Sudan, the border, is really in the Darfur region. And the Darfur region is the region that is most hit by the civil war, because eventually there are signs of ethnic cleansing really happening right now in Darfur again, and so we see a lot of refugee movements from Darfur into Chad. The numbers, 200 to 250,000 Sudanese refugees in Chad over the last couple of months. We expect 600,000 by the end of the year. And it is very much the same that we saw 20 years ago. And one of the reasons why HIAS is able to respond so quickly is because we were already active in 11 refugee camps on the Chadian side, because we started our programs in Chad 20 years ago when the Darfur genocide happened. So we are seeing a repetition of what's happening. You're seeing, I am careful with my words because we do not have substantiated proof yet, but I'm emphasizing the yet. I am fairly sure that within the next few weeks, we will see more and more voices coming up of actually calling it out what it is. We are hearing what refugees are telling us. We have programs on prevention and response to gender-based violence in Chad, and we are hearing the stories. And it's devastating. It's absolutely catastrophic, and we're seeing a country just plumbing into complete chaos. Solutions are not working. There have been at least 3 different summits, and by the African Union, by Saudi Arabia, by Western countries, trying to bring those two forces into some sort of agreement or ceasefire, but it's not really working, and so we have to expect the worst. And right now, these are, I think, 600,000 until the end of the year. I think we might probably even surpass that. And so we are in a mode of gearing up, at the same time preparing ourselves for more. The Chadian team, we have more than 200 people in Chad, is working day and night under very difficult conditions, meaning that they are sleeping on the floor. We do not have enough housing in those areas. This is a remote desert area. We're having quite a lot of deployments of international specialists going into Chad on a weekly basis to make sure that new staff that we have to bring up are trained. We cannot necessarily find the skilled staff. So it is recruitment, training, response, preparedness, all at the same time right now to make sure that we can respond to refugees coming into Chad, especially because working in Sudan is not possible right now.
So I think a lot of times when we talk about conflict, particularly in Africa, there's a narrative that creeps in the United States especially, where we talk about those conflicts as being sort of eternal and ethnic conflicts that are therefore unresolvable, that the root goes back to sort of this ethnic hatred that comes from time immemorial. And I would love for you to share with us a little bit more specifically about what are the causes of the current conflict. So I hear you saying there's a repetition of what happened 20 years ago, but that doesn't mean that it is either somehow eternally rooted or not caused by particular situations that are on the ground right now. So can you help us, for those of us who are not reading deeply about this, understand more about what is behind these conflicts?
Well, the conflict in Sudan specifically is both about resources and tribal rivalism. That's in short. Although, again, if we talk about resources, we have to go back over the last 3-4 years and look how were the rainy seasons over the last 3-4 years, what did that make to the agriculture in the country, and how does that eventually have an effect on resources and the warring fractions. In other countries across Africa where we are seeing conflict, it's different things. In Western Africa and the Sahel, it's a combination of corruption and climate change and already a very poor population. And then there's also an influence of Islamic radicalism that has really created a stronghold in the void of governance in many places across the Sahel, specifically in Burkina Faso, in Mali. And those coups encourage other countries to do coups. I mean, what we're seeing in Niger right now is kind of a result of other coups in the region, and we are seeing that those countries who are actually supporting the Niger coup are those countries that had their own coup over the last 3-4 years. Right. But I love Africa. It's by far the continent where I have spent most of my professional time, and I would hate to leave that room with us thinking that Africa is all about conflict and dysfunction. There are wonderful examples of success in Africa. There's wonderful examples of countries who are receiving and integrating and accepting refugees in a way that we haven't seen in any Western country. There is civil society being built up. There was a cholera outbreak in Tanzania a few years ago. Everybody was kind of jumping up to go and help, and the Tanzanians were like, no, we got it. We don't need you. And everybody was like, what do you mean you got it? No. Our Red Cross is fairly good, and they managed it wonderfully. And I think we have to think more about African civil society. We have to think more about the local capacities that are already there. We also have to be aware that working in a context like Africa does require some more local knowledge. And again, we are seeing some good examples. That said, we are still seeing war in Sudan. Ethiopia is kind of a roller coaster for ages already. Somalia, but again, climate change. I mean, Somalia is all about climate change. I've responded to the famine in Somalia in 2011. That's already 12 years ago. That was, I mean, it was kind of presented as being a conflict between Al-Shabaab and the government, which was partly right, but it really was about climate change and about famine. So Africa is huge. It has one of the most beautiful landscape I've ever seen. The people are wonderful and beautiful, and we do have pockets of crises, and they all have their own dynamics and their own reasons. But yeah, just to say that Africa has also been a place of innovation and a place of wonderful engagement for refugees. As I said, they still host most of the refugees in the world, and some of them really do a wonderful job.
So what is the long-term vision for HIAS? And again, the question of how can we help? Like, you know, we hear these projections about a billion climate refugees by 2040. How on earth can an organization like HIAS prepare for that reality?
I think HIAS alone cannot prepare for that. We are part of a wider system, of a wider community, the humanitarian community. But I think we are the Jewish part of that wider community. HIAS is the global Jewish refugee agency. And I think the part that HIAS can do is engage more with Jewish communities and really create a movement, really create a Jewish movement for refugee rights and for asylum rights. How we do that, we engage with communities all around the world, here in the US, in Europe. We are just opening a new office in South Africa, to really make sure that we can leverage not only the great voice of the Jewish people, but really the values that we have. I mean, I assume I'm not lying if I say that most of us have some sort of experience about refugees, if it is for ourselves or our parents or our grandparents. So there's a lot within the Jewish people. It's their history, it's our responsibility, it's our experience. No, it's not by chance that the Refugee Convention of 1951 or the Human Rights Declaration, they were all drafted by a big part by Jewish people who went through Holocaust or persecution before the Holocaust. So I think really leveraging that voice, the way we're also trying to do here in the US, and the way I'm also asking you to take part is if it is within your municipality or within the state or wherever you have the connections and you can make your voice heard. I think that is eventually what we need to do while we continue to do our work with what we have. We really want to just make sure that we can get as many people on board. We have by far not exhausted. As much as the Jewish people are small people, right? We're only, I don't know, somewhere between 15 and 20 million probably in the world. We have by far not exhausted that resource, and I think that will be the part that HIAS can play.
Thank you. So I want to take questions now. And Rabbi Jensen, may I ask you to go around with the mic? And please, everybody, wait and speak into the mic. It'll be much better for those who are listening on the recording, especially afterwards. So I see a hand right here.
Hi, we're longtime supporters of HIAS, big fans. My question is about the Jewishness of HIAS. I'm wondering, you said HIAS is the Jewish presence within the humanitarian community, and I'm wondering how out HIAS is about that Jewishness. I mean, the name is now an acronym and not Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society anymore, and I'm wondering to what extent other members of the humanitarian community know that HIAS is Jewish, and are there any Arab or Muslim countries that HIAS is not present in because of its Jewishness?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you for asking that. I will start off by saying that everything that HIAS does is Jewish. We do it out of our values, which are Jewish values. We do it out of our responsibility and our experience of being a Jewish organization. Also, when HIAS started in the 1990s to really look at let's help refugees from all backgrounds and not only Jewish people, one of the big reasons for that was that we were at a stage where we saw, like, there's a state of Israel, which is wonderful. It's a place for Jews to find safety. And there weren't so many Jews left anymore. So the diversification to serving all backgrounds was not really a substitution, but it was an add-on. And that is important because we still see the mission of helping Jewish refugees whenever they're in distress as our main mission. And so the way we have helped Jewish refugees from Ukraine, we continue to do so wherever there is. We are currently working very hard on trying to get a group of Jewish people, 49 households of Jewish people who are stuck in Sudan, actually, to get them out. We are supporting the Jewish community of Venezuela, which is under very difficult circumstances for a couple of years already. And so this work is ongoing while we continue to really help Jews from every background. And I think the fact that we also really are now part of this wider humanitarian community is really also giving us the platform to raise the Jewishness to a global level. HIAS is not a small organization. We are very well known in Geneva, in New York. We are the only faith-based organization that has a global MOU with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. We are the 5th biggest implementation partner of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in the world. And so we are able to really bring that to a big arena. And one thing we're doing right now is, we are faith-based, but we're also faith-sensitive because of our faith base. We know why Jewish people survived over 2,000 years. We know where we got the resilience. A lot of it was in our spirit, in our belief. And so whenever we approach refugees, we want to take their spiritual needs into account because we know that a lot of their resilience come out of that spiritual belief. And what HIAS is doing right now, we're engaged with various United Nations organizations on creating faith-sensitive policies to make sure that other NGOs, the United Nations, actually take spiritual needs into account. And we're doing that not only as a Jewish organization, we're doing that in interfaith fora. And I think that's another important part. We had a lot of interfaith fora in humanitarian action that were between Christians and Muslims, but there wasn't a Jewish actor really, and now we do also have a Jewish actor that can really fill that gap. So HIAS is bringing the Jewish voice to the global stage. We are making sure that spiritual needs are taken into account when approaching a refugee or anyone who is in need. We continue to help the Jewish people wherever they are in need, in addition to helping refugees of all backgrounds. And we still see it as our main values. Our values are eventually Jewish values. In terms of our work in other countries, there are many countries we're not working at because we're Jewish. We were asked to enter into Yemen. We had to decline. We're also not really thinking about going into Sudan. It would not be really possible. So the fact that we do have those operations on the Chadian side of the border is really helpful for us to be able to engage. In the Syrian crisis, we really engaged more we focused our response more in Greece, where many of the Syrian refugees were coming in per boat instead of trying to build up in Iraq or in Syria themselves. So it is still an issue which is limiting us in certain ways. Unfortunately, there are many other ways of becoming engaged. But for example, in Chad, 99% of our employees are Muslim. And serving Muslim refugees, they're all aware of us being a Jewish organization. This is not something we're keeping silent. I mean, they all know what it is about. They are all in our all-staff meetings. They see our newsletters, our email. We're not shy about it. The opposite. We actually see it as eventually our raison d'être. It is the reason that we exist is a Jewish reason. And so it is something which is really at the forefront of our mind. we're going through a strategic process right now, which Joe and Nikki know very well about because it's keeping all our staff a bit nuts. And we had a meeting about that strategic process a few weeks ago, and I asked the CEO, Mark Hetfield, in that meeting to say, Mark, is there anything out of bounds? I mean, we're going through a strategic process. How much do you want us to think outside of the box? Like, how much can we open up the question of whom we actually serving or how we are serving them? Should we look at, creating new capacities, etc.? And he said, there's nothing out, there's nothing out of that we cannot touch. We can open up everything. Only the fact that we are a Jewish organization that will not be questioned.
And please say your name too.
Sure. My name's Eric Green. Thanks so much for being here. I got two questions for you. You mentioned earlier donor fatigue. And I think for a lot of people who may be donors or just maybe rank and file people, they also feel that fatigue. They see this kind of cavalcade of crises around the world or at home. And if it's Latin America or Europe or Middle East or Africa or American elections and coups, and people just get a sense of paralysis. They kind of get overwhelmed and stuck and don't think they can do anything. I'm curious what advice you would give to people like that. And then for you personally, who probably is contending with more crises and real pain than you can wrap your hands around on an average day, how do you sustain yourself, and how do you not get overtaken with the enormity of it and feel paralyzed and depressed?
Yeah, that's a tough question, but a very good one. I think to the first question about donor fatigue, I would answer through our Jewish literature, it's not about saving the problem, it's about saving as many lives as you can. And so even if you save only one life, it is as if you have saved the universe. And we couldn't save all the Jews during the Second World War. People tried, whoever was saved. I think that's the reason we're all sitting in this room. And so the fact that there are more and more crises and the fact that it is more difficult to really cover the costs should not deter somebody from giving whatever they can in order to save people. I think the other issue is really, it's less about the amount of issues coming up, it's really this protracted nature of things, and for that, it goes back to, give whatever you can give, but really also do your part on the political and on the advocacy side to make sure that we can end conflict and not sustain conflict over a longer time. As for myself, I think, first of all, it is my profession. I studied public health and disaster management at Tel Aviv University. It's what I know to do best. It's what I've done for the last 15 years. And I don't think that the things that I see or the things that I experience are necessarily much more difficult than what a doctor experiences when he works in the ER every day and sees traffic accident victims coming in. And I don't think that there's any difference or that you can, I'm not saying you can compare, but I'm doing what I know what to do best. I think the difficulty is it does put to your eyes a bit more the cruelty and problems on a global scale. And so sometimes it's hard not to lose faith in humanity. And the other thing is I have a wonderful, amazing wife who has been supporting me for years already. She is 7 months pregnant, has a 1.5-year-old kid, and is by herself for a week, and she will be by herself for another week in 7 days, and for another week in 14 days, because that's what the job takes on. So without her, it would definitely be much more tougher. And care. We have to take care of ourselves. We're putting quite a lot of resources into staff well-being. We're making sure that staff have a hotline at every stage in every language, whatever they need. It is really important to make sure that when people come back from the field, that there's a hot wash, that we kind of engage with them, that we ask questions, really to make sure that people always have an open channel to kind of bring forward their experiences and their concerns. So that is something which is really important. Eventually, you have to make sure that you can help the helper. But I think we're not different than anyone else working in difficult situations. These are all the first responders, and these are mainly the local first responders because they are the ones who are there when it happens. They are still responding. You know, I mentioned we have 85 staff in Ukraine. A big amount of them are displaced by themselves. So these are displaced people working for a humanitarian agency in their own country for other displaced people. And I think for them it is much more tougher than for me.
Let's take one last question, if anybody has, and then we'll wrap up. Or we can end there, because that was a good note to end on, too. Okay, thank you, everybody. Just really grateful to you, Rafael, for joining us. Appreciate the conversation. I just want to say one more time, Joe Goldman here, waving in the back. Joe's got handouts for you, flyers about HIAS, and we are so grateful for our ongoing partnership with HIAS to do advocacy and hands-on work, and looking forward to continuing that relationship.